when you think about North Africa, who do you picture as its original people? Before the Romans, before the Arabs, there was a group of people who have called this land home for thousands and thousands of years. Today, we're going to get into their incredible story.
All right, so let's just jump right in. Who exactly are North Africa's Amazigh people? Now, you might have heard them called by a different name, but the name they use for themselves, well, that tells a really powerful story all on its own.
So first things first, let's talk about the name. The word they use is Amazigh. It means free men. The name you might be more familiar with, Berber, actually comes from the Greek word barbaros, which, is where we get the word barbarian. It was a label put on them by outsiders, and for a lot of people, it really carries the weight of a colonial past. The Amazigh, that's the plural for Amazigh, are the true indigenous people of this huge region. We're talking about a presence that goes back millennia before the arrival of Arabs, making their culture one of the most ancient and continuous on the entire planet.
And their roots go incredibly deep. Genetic evidence actually traces their ancestry all the way back to the very earliest inhabitants of North Africa. We're talking about a time when the Sahara wasn't a desert at all, but this vibrant green landscape. Their connection to this land is just profoundly ancient.
But as you can imagine, a history that long hasn't exactly been a peaceful one. Really, you could define it by a constant struggle for identity, for autonomy. So let's take a look at this history of resistance, a story of a culture that has been under immense pressure for centuries. You can see this constant push and pull right here on this timeline. Way back in 740 AD, you have the Great Berber Revolt, which was the first time anyone successfully broke away from the Arab Caliphate. Then, for a couple of centuries, powerful Amazigh empires actually ruled vast territories. But fast forward to the 20th century, and the pressures just ramped up. First from French colonial policies, and then, after independence, from Arabization policies by new governments, both of which ended up pushing the Tamazight language to the margins.
And what's so fascinating is that the pressure came from two completely different directions. Colonial powers, they used the classic divide and rule strategy. Sometimes they would even promote Amazigh culture just to weaken national unity. But then, after independence, the new states did the complete opposite. They pushed for Arabization to try and build one single unified identity, which, in the end, also sidelined Amazigh language and culture.
So, with all of that pressure, from all these different angles, how on earth did the language and the culture manage to survive? Well, this brings us to the unlikely and often completely unsung guardians of the culture.
This quote right here, it gives us a huge clue. It basically says that the Tamazight language became associated with things considered female within the culture, the home, family, intimacy, oral traditions. And understanding this is absolutely essential to understanding how the language was kept alive.
What happened was a clear split. You had two different spheres. Tamazight became the language of the private world, of the home, of family, of the local community, and because of that, it was primarily spoken and preserved by women. Meanwhile, literary Arabic completely dominated the public sphere, government, business, formal religion, which, at the time, was almost entirely the domain of men.
And this is exactly how they did it. With pretty much zero support from the state, rural women became the keepers of the culture. They passed it down through these vibrant oral traditions like poetry and songs. They're called tizeren. They did it through storytelling, through the unique patterns they wove into textiles, and maybe most importantly, by raising their children to speak Tamazight as their true mother tongue.
And just listen to this. It's a beautiful, powerful example of that oral tradition. We are one, me and you. We share walls, our fields share boundaries and springs. You see, this poetry wasn't just art for art's sake. It was the social fabric. It was how community bonds were reinforced, how conflicts were settled.
Okay, so let's fast forward to the modern era and see how this all plays out. After centuries of being preserved in private, a new push began to bring the language out into the open, to move it from just being in the Constitution to being part of everyday conversation.
And then, in 2011, a massive turning point. After years and years of activism, Tamazight was officially recognized as an official language in the Moroccan Constitution. This was a monumental, hard-won victory. It really seemed to promise a brand new future.
But, a law on paper is one thing. What people experience in their daily lives, that can be something else entirely. It's been more than a decade since that historic moment, so the big question is, what's actually changed on the ground?
Well, recent studies give us a pretty clear, if complicated, picture.
The vast majority of Moroccans, they totally support preserving the language, and most of them agree that getting it integrated into public life is crucial. But, and it's a big but, a significant chunk of the population feels that its official status just hasn't really been effective. They see this huge gap between the promise and the reality.
So why the holdup? Well, the challenges are pretty serious. There's what many see as a lack of real political will to actually implement the law. That's combined with a very practical shortage of trained teachers and classroom resources. And on top of all that, you still have these lingering attitudes that Tamazight is somehow less useful for a career than other languages. For a lot of people, the dream of full recognition feels delayed.
So where does all of this leave the future of Tamazight? You know, its past survival might just offer the biggest clue about its future resilience.
And really, this is the most important takeaway from this whole story. For century after century, Tamazight didn't survive because of some official law or government program. It survived because of the women who kept it alive in their homes, in their songs, in their stories, passing it down from one generation to the next.
And that leaves us with this final, vital question. A language can be recognized by law, right? Its status can be elevated in a constitution. But how is it truly kept alive in the day-to-day lives of its people? That, right there, remains the central challenge and the profound legacy of the Amazigh.